My name is Craig, and I'm trying to reduce suffering in product development. So, bad joke. There's two agile coaches, and they're evil, and they commit a murder. And it happens in Texas, so they're caught, convicted, and because it's Texas, they're sentenced to death. Now, there's this tradition there that you get one last wish, like a meal. And so the jailer comes into the jail cell where the two agile coaches are and looks at them and says, "Boys, tomorrow you die. You get one last wish. What would you like?" And the first agile coach goes, "Oh, I've always had the desire to present a thorough and academic lecture on the subject of modern methodology. If I could give that talk before I die, I'd be a happy man." The jailer looks at him and goes, "You're a sick man. But I tell you what, tomorrow at noon, we'll round up all the prisoners, bring them to the auditorium, you can give your talk, and then we'll kill you." So then he turns to the second agile coach who's been listening to this and says, "Boy, you get one last wish too. What would you like?" And the second agile coach looks at him and says, "I have only one wish now. Can you kill me before noon tomorrow?" So I hope this 30 minutes is not quite that painful. I want to start by analyzing the different words in the title. So the first is organizational design. And the key thing I'd like to share is that less, which implies simplification, but also implies large-scale Scrum, is not a process and not a methodology. And I would like to suggest to you that in fact, Scrum, if you're an organizational design expert, you will understand is not a process, but also an organizational design. And so this is important. We're not just playing with language here. Because, for example, if you were to say to the CEO of a company, "Oh, we're going to adopt something new, it's a new process," then what does the CEO think that their job is? Well, probably to support it, best case, and that's probably the end of it. On the other hand, if you go to a reasonably well-educated CEO and you say to her, we want to introduce a deep change in the organizational design, then what does the CEO understand is her responsibility? And the answer is, "Oh, I have to be at the center of this." Most CEOs would understand that, because organizational design is the raison d'être of part of the C-suite. They're responsible for defining structures, policies, career paths, strategy, and so forth. They wouldn't think of delegating something as central to the company as organizational design to middle managers. And so this is not just playing with language. If one incorrectly describes less or other actual approaches as a new way of working or a new process or a new methodology, we've lost. Because then the C-suite incorrectly thinks it's just something they have to support rather than something they themselves would have to lead and be in the center of owning and driving. Because most well-educated senior leaders understand that org design is their job. And so I'd like to encourage all of you to think about shifting your terminology, not just because we're playing with words, but because it's true. This is about organizational design. And this derivation of Galbraith's star model picture, which is a standard kind of model or ontology of how to think about org design really illustrates the point. You can't just take one thing. For example, if you were to say to a team members ostensibly adopting Scrum, and one of the ideas is multi-learning, and they've got single career titles like designer or architect, and you say to them, well, ignore that multi-learning, I mean the opposite. I mean, focus now on multi-learning. Ignore the fact that you're an architect. Ignore the fact that your job title is business analyst, and in 2 weeks you have a performance review to go from BA1 to BA2. Ignore all that because it's a new mindset. Blah, blah, blah. Well, that's a fantasy. Until you fix the organizational design, people's behavior is not going to change. If you offer project managers bonuses for the successful completion of their projects and punishments if they don't, and then you say to them, oh, hey, let's adopt Scrum, and so why don't you be transparent and tell us about how fucked up everything is all the time? It's a mindset change. Well, it's a fantasy. Unless you fix the organizational design elements that are consistent with what you want, you're not going to get what you want, because it's far deeper than just behavior and attitude. So this title is Org Design for Large-Scale Adaptive Product Development. What do I mean? What do we mean by large scale? Simply many teams, more than one team, working together on one product. And a key idea that we'd like to suggest is the way to scale is by descaling the organization. The way to be able to make more teams work together is not by adding more roles and processes, but by removing them, simplifying the organization. Now, notice that I used in the title the word adaptive. I didn't use the word agile. And as a little bit of background, in September of the year 2000, Bob Martin, and many people don't know this, it was Bob Martin that kicked this all off. Bob Martin, an old colleague of mine, invited me to go to this meeting. He said he was the owner of a company that was doing XP coaching. I was an enthusiastic XP coach. And he said basically in his email to me and Martin Fowler and Kent Beck and others, hey Craig, I'd like to get together because we've only got these different disparate approaches like XP and Scrum and DSDM and so forth, and the name that we're using for them at the moment is lightweight methods. And he said in the email, kicking this off, don't think that's going to be a good name. We need to get together, come up with a name, and also he wanted some common marketing slogans that we could all use consistently. And by the way, some people don't know this, where the Agile Manifesto came from was more simply brainstorming a group of marketing slogans that the group could use in a kind of a consistent way, because we were all self-employed entrepreneurs and so forth. And many people also don't know that the way that the word agile was chosen was through some idea generation and then voting. Jim Highsmith was at the meeting, and at the time, he was a very influential figure in the field, the author of the book Adaptive Software Development, and his approach was called Adaptive Software Development, so it's not surprising that Jim offered the word adaptive on the list in Snowbird, February 2001. Mike Beadle was also there, and he had just finished reading a book published in 1994 called Virtual Organizations and Agile Competitors, or something like that. And so he remembered that word, and so Mike offered the word agile to the list. And unfortunately, I couldn't go to the meeting because last minute I was called away to Paris, France to work with my company. And so I could only interview some of the people afterwards. And I remember one of the people I interviewed afterwards to ask them why they ended up voting more for the word agile than adaptive. They said, well, I figured that if I voted for the word adaptive, that then Jim Highsmith would get all the business. And out of this selfish concern of making sure that Jim didn't get all of the business, the word agile got a few more votes than the word adaptive. But the key point that I want to make from this story is that those two words were being considered as synonyms for this movement, and also that nobody in the group meant by these words fast or flow or efficient or incremental. That was not in people's minds. What they were trying to communicate, and Martin Fowler has a good short history blog post on this afterwards, was to create an approach where with low effort, with low effort, they could change direction based upon learning. So we were trying to suggest a kind of humility in product development, that we often don't know what is the most skillful thing to do. And therefore, a kind of scientific method approach in product development, I used to describe it in the 1980s, where we have a guess or hypothesis, and with humility we say, this guess of what features we should create or what impact we're going to have could be wrong. And so we'll take a step, we'll do an experiment, discover that we're wrong, great, we've falsified our guess, and then we change direction. And what the group was trying to suggest with the word adaptive or the word agile was not to be able to deliver fast. Very common misunderstanding. It was to be able to stop and then say, that approach isn't good, let's try something different and switch to a different direction. That's why agile was called agile. It's not a synonym for fast. And because it seems to me that almost the entire world has lost the plot on what agile was meant to mean. It's incorrectly come to mean flow and fast and efficient, which had nothing to do with it. I'd like to suggest that we use the word that didn't get quite as many votes. Now, as far as I know, Jim is retired now, so it's not such a big issue. And we could adopt the word adaptive. And I'm not a complete fantasist. I well recognize that changing names isn't going to really fix things. But if the entire world community dropped the word agile and introduced the word adaptive, you know what it would do at least, which is raise a question. And that question would at least provide an opportunity to explain what was trying to be suggested in the early days and why. Double-clicking on this word adaptive, rhetorical question, how might you measure adaptiveness? Well, if you break it down, there's really two parts. There's transaction cost and there's switching cost. So for example, I know you're all quite young, so you wouldn't know this, but back in the 1970s, we used to, in development, do this thing called manual testing, where humans actually interacted with a computer to test software. Is incredibly inefficient, but that's what people knew how to do. So imagine it's the 1970s and we have testers doing manual testing, and I add up the cost, and let's say for every delivery cycle, it's $50,000 of manual testing cost. And then I go to the CFO of the company and I say, for every delivery cycle, there's a transaction cost of $50,000 in terms of person hours translated to do the testing. And then I ask the CFO, how many cycles should we do a year? 1 or 20? Well, what are they going to say? 1, obviously, because they're thinking about reducing the transaction costs associated with each cycle. And so much of the education I've observed in the adaptive space has not actually been focused on the switching side of the story, but on the transaction side of the story, making it able to do a cycle with less overhead, with automation, simpler techniques, and so forth. And that's great. But all that that gets you to is delivering fast and flow. And that wasn't the point of the adaptive movement. This is not the adaptive movement wasn't meant to be a way to deliver shit fast. It was meant to be a way to discover and learn and change direction to get the most bang for the least buck, to really make an impact skillfully through learning. And that takes us to switching cost. So you're doing something, you discover unskillful, we measure the impact, it's not making the impact, and then you have to change direction. And so then you can add up the costs. Okay, there's all of this work in progress. How much effort is it going to cost to wind it all down? And then you need to introduce the new ideas. What's the cost and the time to wind back up before something comes out the other end that you didn't anticipate before? That's switching cost. And if you want to think about measuring adaptiveness, it really comes through low transaction cost and low switching cost. And then when you have those two wings of that bird, then that bird of adaptiveness can fly. And so another suggestion is to start thinking more about all of the organizational design elements and techniques that inhibit switching cheaply, not just delivering fast. What are some example org design elements related to this idea? I'm going to define a term and then analyze it a little bit. Component teams are a standard English term to refer to programmers that are attached to different pieces of code. Front-end team with front-end code, component team. Back-end team with back-end code, component team. And when you hear phrases like our code, your code, we need to ask the front-end team to change their code. When you hear things like that, you have component teams, programmers attached to different chunks of code. And there's a gazillion synonyms of this. Front-end, back-end, database team, analytics team, reporting team, microservices teams, common services teams, library teams, app teams, iOS teams, web teams. Every one of those names and many, many more are all just synonyms for component teams. So what? What's the implication of this organizational design? Notice that this is not a process and this is not a method. The structure of teams is an organizational structure element, and therefore it's not fixed by new practices. It requires management decision in order to formally change the organizational structure. So what? What's the implication of that? I want to look at the implications of having component teams with a story. Let's consider that the product development group has received a requirement F1. Now, there's two possible cases. The internal group has kind of dreamed up F1, or it's come in externally. Maybe the government requires you to conform to some new financial regulation. Let's suppose it's the case where it comes in from outside, from customers or a regulatory body. What's the first question that needs to be solved? Answer some kind of understanding of what F1 means. That's typically called analysis. I'm not going to debate the value of that term. If we have front-end teams, middle-tier teams, back-end teams, which one of these component teams should do the business analysis? It's not clear because there's component teams. That's a key point. Or the user experience analysis. Should the back-end COBOL team do the user experience analysis? Well, it's not clear. Why would they? So notice that if you start with the assumption, usually the unexamined assumption, and constraint that you have component teams, it gives birth to this problem, this question, who's going to do the analysis? And then it gives birth to a kind of obvious answer. We need to add a new team. And let's call that team or teams the analysts. And this can be business analysis and UX analysis. Once there's some at least vague understanding of what this requirement is about, another question that is going to come up is if it involves some kind of human interaction, some kind of a user interface and external product design, the question is, who's going to do the external product design? Who's going to do the human interaction design? Well, if we have component teams, should the domain layer team do the human interaction design? Should the COBOL developers do it? It's not really clear. Maybe the front-end team would do it, but sometimes not. Sometimes they're locally optimized on, oh, they're the JavaScript developers. They don't do product design. And so consequently, a very common solution to this problem is the following. Let's make another group. And we'll pass on that document, and let's call those folks designers. Now, the next question that arises is, well, if there's, let's say, 500 components, because in my world, I don't work in little tiny software products with like 3 or 10 components. My world and Bus's world is there might be 1,000 or 2,000 developers on a single product, tens or hundreds of millions of lines of code, and hundreds of separate components, and therefore hundreds of component teams. That's the world I come from. And so one of the questions we have to answer for F1 is, what components are touched? Because we're going to have to assign the task of programming to the different component teams that are involved in F1. Now, what person is going to answer the question, what components are being touched by F1? It's not clear. We have a kind of chicken and egg problem. Which component team should we ask which component team? It's not clear. And so this yet again gives rise to the apparent need for another group. And once again, there'll be some kind of a handoff of information. Whoops. And typically in pure software organizations, these people are usually called architects. I work often in hardware and software, self-driving cars, telecom equipment, that kind of stuff. And then in the hardware software world, these folks are often called systems engineers. So before going further, I want you to note that the apparent need for these roles was a side effect of having started with component teams. If you have those, it apparently gives birth to the need for these positions and related artifacts or documents. Let's introduce the development teams, the component teams to this now. And let's keep it relatively simple. Let's just say there's 3 component teams involved. Now, a question that arises is, can we give, for example, these documents to that team, and can they extract their component team work from those holistic documents, which are talking about the feature as a whole? Now, if your entire company is 2 or 3 teams, yes, and that's often how it works. But in my world, the world of large scale, it doesn't work like that. And you typically need a person in front of these teams. And they'll create a document, which is then handed off to the component teams. And it's this person here which will typically consume these documents and extract information from them and create then this task, this component task for this component team. And I've seen many names for this role over the years. The one that I've seen that amuses me the most is technical business analyst. What? You can even see in the name how weird it is. Or other variations, technical systems analyst or system business analyst or all of these Frankensteins. By the way, if you ask this team, what is this? You know what they'll typically say? Oh, that's a customer requirement. We're delivering value. All right. Moving on. Now, is it possible for the following next step? No. This visualization suggests that the three teams are making the code together and it's being integrated together. But this is a grotesque misrepresentation. Why? There's two reasons. One is because, in fact, there's not 3 component teams, there's 100 component teams or 50 component teams. And secondly, there's not just F1 going through the system, there's F1 through F50 going through the system. So in fact, all of these are multiple documents in front of all of these different groups. This is taking me towards the first reason. And key point, if you've got these 50 different component teams, different stakeholders will pressure the development organization for their component teams to do things in different priorities, to scratch the itches of different stakeholders. So this component team here might be working on their task in F1, whereas this component team here on Monday might be working on their task for F10 because of the shifting priorities across the different component teams. And that's one reason why it's incorrect to view the code as all coming together from the different teams, because they're working asynchronously. They're not all working in lockstep on their parts of F1. And one reason is the shifting priorities. A second reason for the shifting priorities is that even if this team and this team were both working on their tasks for F1 starting on Monday at 9 a.m., well, it could take, for example, this team 17 person hours to finish their component task, but it could take this team 100 person hours to finish their component task for F1. So even if at 9 a.m. they started it off on lockstep on their different tasks for F1, because they've got different lengths, then of course when one team finishes their task, they'll go on to another, and now they're working asynchronously on different tasks for different features at the same time. And for those of you who are programmers, you will understand why this makes the possibility of integrating all of the code together for the feature is not going to happen, because it's not all there. I'm in component team 1, might be making code that is going to lead to a call to component 2. But the component 2 team, who is responsible for the handler for that call, they're not handling it because they're working on a different task that day. So therefore, I can't integrate the code because it all won't work together. And consequently, what has to happen, therefore, as a result, is that this is what happens. The code is in some way sort of separated. How do they do this? Well, by far the most common technique is to use branches. And I'm jumping ahead a little bit to the concept of continuous integration, but you can probably appreciate that branching, lots of branches, and continuous integration are not consistent. This leads to branching hell, and especially at scale, this doesn't work very well. By the way, I suggest that you read the book Software Engineering at Google, which describes how thousands of developers work in one mono repo on one code base, all on head of trunk, and they avoid branches to show how this is possible. If you've got people who are promoting the idea of separate branches, that will actually create a world of problems. And so therefore, we all know about the concept of continuous integration, but in fact, we can't do continuous integration because the code is not actually being integrated. It's in like separate repositories, etc. Now, back in the 90s, I got to learn about XP from Kent Beck. I'm an old Smalltalk programmer. Kent's an old Smalltalk programmer. And Kent is the person who popularized continuous integration and taught me a little bit about what it means. So I'm going to try to share this from the person who introduced the idea. And many people are surprised by what continuous integration actually means. Not everybody knows. Continuous integration means to integrate continuously. Now, you know, that there is just worth the price of the conference all by itself. Now, you know, it sounds funny, but I go to companies and I ask them, are you doing continuous integration? And they say, oh, yes. And then they start talking about a build server system. If you hear someone talking about build server systems in the same breath as continuous integration, that's a sign the person really doesn't understand the concept. I mean, and that's okay. I'm not trying to make them feel bad. It's an opportunity to help educate them. But continuous integration, as it was intended, key point, is a behavior by developers. It's got nothing to do with tools. It's got nothing to do with build systems. You can have the most fancy build system in the world running at the speed of light, but if I check out my code and I keep it checked out for days and I keep it on a separate branch, we are not integrating continuously. And that's what's going on here. So this group has delayed integration with all of its classic software engineering negatives and other negatives. Well, at some point, like for example, you might not believe this, back in the 1970s, do you know how long our cycles were before delivering? 10 weeks. In the 1970s, we would go 10 weeks before we would deliver, insanely long periods of time, but eventually we did eventually pull it together. And in the 1970s, how did we solve this problem of having all of this separate code that needs to come together? Well, what we did in the 70s is that we introduced a new role. And this was called Release Manager. And then they would interrupt and interact with the teams until finally the code would all be integrated to support the release. Well, we've now taken the requirement F1 and we've chopped it up across a lot of different groups. So we have a coordination problem and a tracking problem. What do we need? We need coordination managers. So, hey, let's add some. And we're going to need a bunch of them. And these people, if you really think about what they're doing coordination management, although they're usually called project managers. But at this level, it's got very little to do with project, and it has a lot to do with coordination and tracking. And notice that this apparent problem, this problem of coordination, is a side effect of starting with component teams. That's what's given birth to this entire situation. So what? Well, it depends what you want. I often say to people, there's no good or bad organizational design. I'm not interested in making moral judgments. If your organization is optimized to shift bonuses of cash to senior managers, as is the case in financial services, that's okay. It's fine. It's legal. But if you want your product development organization to be consistent with high adaptiveness, low lead time, and working on highest quality, then we can just logically analyze this organizational design and explore the question, is it consistent with those things? Let's just take adaptiveness to start with. So imagine as a thought experiment, we introduce a whole set of requirements. It takes some months for it to work its way through the system until some code finally comes out the other end. And then, surprise, we say to the entire group of 500 people, please, we're going to wind down everything that you're working on because we realize everything that we're doing was unskillful and we're going to stop it. And we're going to introduce brand new ideas that we have not thought of before. Now start the clock on how that long it takes before something new comes out the other end, and add up all of the costs of people's time to wind down the whip and to wind up the whip, and you will see that this model is far, far away from being consistent with low transaction cost and low switching cost. Therefore, inconsistent with adaptiveness. What about lead time? No. What about highest value? This one is a bit subtler to understand. Could it be that this organizational structure is consistent with working on highest value? Let's analyze this a little bit more closely. Imagine, in theory, I have a list of items sorted by high value, number 1, number 2, down to number 15. Further, because we're talking about component teams, we could answer the question, what components and component teams are involved? So, for example, for requirement number 1, component team 3 through component team 10 are involved, and so on. Now, for number 15 in this list prioritized by value, it touches C18. And key point, it's the first time that component C18 is worked on, not items 1 through 14. So now let's do a little thought experiment. Imagine it's day 1 of this story, and the CEO, it's day 1, they're just starting to work on number 1, and the CEO comes to the development group, and she goes to the room where the C18 developers work, and she opens the door on day 1, and there's nobody there. And so she goes to the manager of the C18 team and she says, hey, where's the C18 developers? And the manager says, well, we estimate that it's going to take at least 6 months before we're going to start working on number 15, when the C18 team needs to do some work. So I've asked them to go on vacation for the next 6 months, and then they'll check in and see if it's time to come in and do the typing for number 15. So does the CEO say, wow, that's a great idea? No. She says, hey, on day one, I expect them to be busy. This is an organization optimized for busyness, activity, not outcome. This is an organization optimized for output, not outcome. And so on day one of this theoretical company, the team C18 works on low-value number 15. This is not an organization organized by high value. By the way, it gets even funnier, because after they've finished their work on number 15, what are they going to do for the next 5.5 months? They have to make shit up, because they have to justify making output. Well, what do component teams output? Code. And if they were to sit around not making more code for 6 months, that would be considered inefficient or unproductive. So they make stuff up and they make more code. Now imagine there's 4 programmers in this team, and this story goes on for 5 years. Now they've got so much code, they say, we 4 programmers aren't enough. We need a 5th programmer. And so now you have a reinforcing loop where the code gets even bigger and bigger with more speculation. So to conclude, this model is not consistent with adaptiveness, low lead time, or highest value. Now, here's the good news. The managers of this group go to a course on scaling with agility. And they come back and they put the organization through a deep change so that afterwards it will be consistent with adaptiveness, low lead time, and high value. Here's what it looks like. Here we are. Oops. Now we have product owners who create epics, agile designers who create design stories, agile architects who write agile epics, team product owners who write stories, Scrum teams, DevOps, and Scrum masters. And previously, this organization we could show was inconsistent with adaptiveness, low lead time, and high value, but now it is. This is all that I've seen for the 25 years that I've been working in this area. Which leads then to one final thought. What is an example of an org design element that is consistent with adaptiveness and low lead time? And the answer is feature teams. A feature team works across the entire code base, and they're problem solvers, not programmers. They're product developers, not software developers. And I'd like to appreciate the metaphor that the Finnish thought leader Ari Tikka has suggested that mostly what's going on in development, or should be going on in development, is dreaming, thinking, doing. A simple way to describe almost everything that can go on. And in traditional organizations, we divide up the dreaming and the thinking and the doing. And one of the big ideas of features teams is that they're involved in that entire world. They dream with the customer, they think through how to develop, and they deliver. And they're involved in everything from analysis to design to architecture to coding to testing to measuring their impact to interviewing customers. They're involved in the co-creation of the product. And I hope you can see from this simple example that what we're trying to suggest in LESS is not based upon some kind of a religious belief, but it's a logical analysis that if you actually set adaptiveness as your optimizing goal, then you can logically analyze an organization to say, is it consistent or inconsistent with adaptiveness as the optimizing goal? And feature teams are more consistent and component teams are less consistent, which is why we suggest the use of feature teams. But that said, in our first LESS book, we wrote a chapter called False Dichotomies, which is a common English phrase to mean when people set up arguments with only two alternatives. And us humans have a kind of very binary bias, and politicians play on this bias psychologically. So humans very typically want to go to one extreme or the other. And the LESS world is not about extremes. We're very much in the middle. So for example, we suggest, and this is how I say it officially, that the majority, 51%, the majority of teams are feature teams because that still leaves lots of room for component teams for all kinds of contexts where you see them strongly motivated. And one of the things that we're trying to encourage in LESS is moving beyond these strong dichotomies of just this or just that, and recognizing there can be a middle way that balances different forces. The last thing that I'll comment on is that by moving from component teams and all of the related complex org design elements to feature teams, almost everything we saw in that complex picture that I drew disappears. And so we're simplifying the organization. We call it descaling. And by that descaling, we're able to scale for more teams to be able to co-create a product where we're focusing on outcome and not output. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We got a few questions coming in, and if you want to ask the question, this is the right moment to do it. And the very first important question I get so far, and you need to know who asked this question later on. Where to send CV to work for in feature teams?
I was at the LESS conference a few days ago, and I noticed there was a company there called PandaDoc. I don't know if they're a Polish company, but they're an Eastern European company, I think.
They have a software development group in Krakow for sure, not sure about the other stuff. Anyone from the PandaDocs now?
Belarusian plus Ukrainian.
Maybe not Ukraine this year.
This year?
No, I meant not a good time to join a team in Ukraine this year.
I mean, you can, just not the software development this year.
Yeah. So my point is anyways that PandaDoc's an example of one company, and I don't know the local market, so I don't know if there's other companies that have adopted feature teams.
By the way, the last week there was a LESS conference, so if you watch some of those videos, you will hear about the stories from the companies, AgileByExample stories from the companies who are trying to do this one. By the way, who was the question? I mean, who asked this question? That's my serious question. Who asked this question? Anyone? Oh, there's a hand. Okay, so after the talk, you come here and you get a prize, and we get a special prize for the first question, which I'm going to ask. So the question number 2 with the S word, I'm not gonna sure if I should ask this one. I'm gonna move to the next one. No, okay. Anyway, you vote. Craig, you said you don't know anything about safe, but you draw it perfectly with all these components teams. That's not a question, that's a statement, but maybe you can comment.
What was the second part of this?
Yeah, so you don't know anything about safe, but you drew it perfectly with all the component teams.
Oh, that's just because I do know almost nothing about SAFE. Many years ago, its creator asked me if he could get a copy of our lean thinking picture, and I know he took that, but that's the extent that I know about it. The picture that I'm drawing is just a standard traditional organizations and how they play the fake agile game.
So that the second prize goes to Victor, and the third one, I get it. I have more questions, but I'm gonna go with this one. Is how do you maintain overarching architecture, provided you need one, when you organize around feature teams?
This is an interesting question with a generalized answer. So cross-functional teams are a variation of a feature team. By the way, a feature team is cross-functional and cross-component, to distinguish between what a cross-functional team is and a feature team. And to generalize, as you might know, in management ideas, cross-functional teams go back to, I'd have to check, but like around World War II, formally. And so when you have, on the other hand, functional teams, like an architecture team and a human interaction design team, etc., you have consistency around that concern. You solve the problem of consistency around the concern with separate functional teams. Well, that's good, but the price you pay for that is the creation of a waterfall, queues, and other things which are inconsistent with adaptiveness and low lead time, and therefore not a very good way usually to solve the problem of consistency. So when organizations started to move to cross-functional teams, which goes back to the 1940s or 50s, this is not a new idea, then arose this problem of consistency of function across cross-functional teams. It's an old problem, and there's an old solution. And this was called communities. So the idea is that whenever you have a cross-functional organization, you will need communities that cut across the teams. An architecture community, a human interaction design community, a security community, etc. Now, who are the members of these communities? Answer, the product developers that are in the feature teams. It's not a separate official group. It's not composed of separate overhead people or managers. It's just the regular product developers that temporarily participate in this. So to take the architecture one as an example, you will need a long-lived architecture community. We recommend that every community have a formal community leader, which would be one of the regular product developers who volunteers for this role, usually for 1 year, so they have a day job in product development, but they also spend some of the time focusing on this community, and then every year rotating to a different community leader. And then the architecture community, for example, with the community leader, would regularly organize things like meetings. And they would explore questions such as, what commonality and consistency do we need in the architecture? Now remember, the people in the room that's having this conversation are the regular hands-on developers from the different teams. So they'll be able to execute on these ideas in their teams. And so they come together, they come to common design ideas or common standards, and then in their teams, these are then realized. And that's true for all of the different major functional concerns, architecture, security, and so forth. And to summarize and conclude this point, it's really important to have well-running communities in a cross-functional organization. And in our third LESS book and in our second LESS book, we have many tips and guides for how to make these communities work more effectively.
And who's the owner of this question? You? Guys, seriously? Okay, you get the third prize, and by the way, the prizes are the third book, which was recently, quite recent, like 2018?
16,
17,
16, I
like
think, yeah.
So we get 3 of those. They were already signed by Basfode and will be signed by Craig after, so you need to come back here after. That's all the prizes we have, but not all the questions we have. So I'm going to move to the one of my favorite. I'm kind of surprised it show up so late. So who owns the code? It leads to other problems, knowing all the code for 30 teams, or 30 components in this case.
Right. So nobody owns the code. You have what's called shared code. And if you think that that's impossible, I recommend you read the book Software Engineering at Google, because that's what they do. So as an existence proof, Google has around 50,000 software developers, fact, and they do work in one mono repo with billions of lines of code in it. And there are exceptions, but in general, there are some real exceptions, but in general, most programmers can change any code anywhere. So there's no concept of code ownership. And as an existence proof, Google makes it work. So if you say, oh, that's not possible, Google proves you wrong. If you say, oh, you can't do that at scale, Google proves you wrong. And the devil is in the details on this one, how you make shared code work effectively at a large scale. And I think the best way to answer that question is to carefully study the entire book, Software Engineering at Google, because they've got many elements which makes thousands of developers be able to work together on a gigantic code base. One last comment I'll make, wrapping it up, is notice that the question could be an example of a false dichotomy. Maybe the person asking the question says, well, either a developer only knows a little bit of code or they have to know all the code. That's a false dichotomy, because there's a million points in between. And furthermore, if code is really well crafted and clean with massive amounts of test automation all the time, which is what Google does, then it's possible developers to walk into spaces of code that they didn't work in before and to actually start to learn and work with it with less of a switching cost because the code quality is so high.
Thank you. This one is also interesting. Can you implement organizational change only for technology department, or it needs a big change in the whole company? So talking about the whole change, and I have an example of 800 people in tech, 5,000 company total.
Question, what is organizational design? It's the decisions about structure, policies, career paths, processes, the existence of managers, etc. Question, who can change that for a product development group? And it depends. I've worked in some organizations where the complete control of the product development organization, from finance to structure to all policies, is under the control of some kind of senior R&D manager. And in that case, that R&D manager has the power to change everything. And on the other hand, I've been at places where a bank or an insurance company would be a typical example. It is truly only the group CEO and the CFO that have the authority to change the organizational design. And in that case, they're going to have to be directly involved in this. So the sort of precise answer is the people that have the authority to change all aspects of the org design. And who that is depends upon the company.
And I guess it's also worth to mention that you're not going to change 800 people at the same time in less.
Yeah, let me take your prompting point as a point. So one of the things that we suggest in less is what we call parallel organization. Having been involved in change for many, many years, if you try to change an existing IT or big organization, it's almost certainly going to fail. And if you do make deep change, let me know how you did it, because I don't see that. But what can work is to create parallel to that entire product group, a new separate parallel organization, key point, with only 30 or 50 developers, like 6 or 7 feature teams. And the idea that we suggest, a kind of baby step building on Yuta's comment about incremental change, is that if you've got 1,000 or 2,000 people in an existing product development group, let it be, leave it alone, don't try to destabilize it, don't fight it, and instead set up a completely separate parallel organization that doesn't report to the head of IT or anything like that. It's a new reporting line into the CEO directly. And that parallel organization has a completely new org design as though it were a new company. And there's only 30 or 50 people there. And we try to get that new organization working effectively on the same code base as the traditional organization. So you've got the big traditional organization, you've got the very small parallel organization working on the same product and the same code. And this can be a more manageable change. And it also creates an existence proof that this new parallel organization is more consistent with adaptiveness, low lead time, and working on higher value, which then makes it a more of a motivation for it to grow.
And by the way, you have in mind 30 to 50 product developers, not 30 to 50 managers.
Yeah, maximum 1 manager.
Yeah, good to mention that, anyway. So I get 2 more, which are kind of related to each other. So one is, how about the cost of developers from a feature team learning complexity of a piece of code he never saw before? And the second is kind of related to this one. Is it possible to have feature teams if you have 100 of services written in different programming languages? So the learning curve in both cases.
Well, the first question boils down to, we don't have time to learn. If you're in a company where the managers are saying, we can't even take the time to learn to improve, it's a waste of time to even work in that company to try to introduce change. It's so dysfunctional, forget it. So I wouldn't even bother to work with a company where they say that. If the managers are so uninsightful and so low quality that they can't support and value people taking the time to learn new things. And then the second part was? Oh, the lots of code,
the different
services. So the second question about many programming languages and a lot of code, I've somewhat commented on before. It's unlikely, first of all, that any one developer will need to know millions of lines of code, the first point, because they're learning incrementally into new areas of the code base over time. Secondly, if you work as a programmer and if you're working in clean code, it's not that difficult. If you've got really clean code, everything is surrounded by millions of automated tests running 24/7. It's not so difficult to move into new parts of the code base that you haven't worked in before. But if you've never worked in clean code like that, you can't appreciate that experience. Second, many disparate languages. Well, this is actually therefore an argument for reducing the heterogeneity of your technologies. If you care about low lead time and adaptiveness, then having a plethora of many different technologies is inconsistent. Now, I'm a programmer myself, and I'm a big fan of new technologies, but at the same time, putting on my hat as an entrepreneur or someone who has to invest money, I would want to carefully limit that growth. If you look, for example, at what Google does and what Meta does, is that they very carefully choose how many new programming languages can be introduced. They are willing to have, moving beyond the false dichotomy of only 1 versus 50 different languages, Google will have like 3 or 4 different allowed languages. And if a programmer cannot learn 3 or 4 different programming languages, you need to find better programmers. It's not that complicated.
I'm going to add to that. How about the hardware? So how you mentioned that you were working software and hardware. So how about the hardware, which you get a little even more engineering skills?
So to generalize the answer, the real issue is the barrier of knowledge to be able to work in the thing. And in 1980, the barrier of knowledge for a programmer, computer scientist, to work in hardware was kind of high. But now we have FPGAs and 3D printing, and increasingly hardware is becoming softer. And in my opinion, today, most pure hardware work still has to be done by pure hardware folks, creating kind of a hard handoff. But every decade that passes, that's becoming softer. FPGAs is a classic example of that. Now, programmers are essentially working on the hardware. And on the boundary of things like firmware and drivers, this is a place where there's many classic agile software engineering techniques which can help bridge the gap effectively. But it is still today a harder boundary. And to summarize, every 10 years it'll get better.
Okay, I get one question which is not programming related. So we do understand that achieving excellence in writing code is vital. What about management excellence? Is there any? How would you define it?
Management excellence. Yes. So back in the early 90s at MIT Sloan School of Management, researchers there, Peter Senge and others, looked into the behavior of managers that seemed to be quite effective in what they called learning organizations. And out of that came the book called The Fifth Discipline, which as far as I know is the best-selling book ever in the history of management. It's a classic, The Fifth Discipline, and it is as useful to read today as then. And in that book, the MIT group goes through the 5 disciplines that they see associated with true managers that are working at an excellent level. And some of those include, for example, awareness of their own mental states, and having the humility to be mindful that their own beliefs and mental activity could be wrong. It includes the ability to create a shared vision effectively. It includes the ability that they're systems thinkers rather than local thinkers, as an example.
All right, given the time we have, and I want to be on time with closing, I'm going to ask the last one, which is pretty cool. Who should handle bugs, defects from field or customer in feature team organization?
At scale, we recommend a rotation responsibility for feature teams. So suppose, for example, there's 20 feature teams associated with the product, and it's January. Feature team 1 doesn't take on feature work, but they leave slack in their schedule to take on all surprises, of which bugs are only an example. There could be a request from the salespeople to the developers to work on some contract. And that 1 or 2, we call them surprise teams, absorbs all the surprises, including all of the bugs. Unless it's like a really high priority bug that the super expert needs to fix, so then plan B is to delegate to the super expert and interrupt them. But in the normal flow of events, these feature teams who might not know how to solve the bug very well to begin with, they can take the time and then they learn a lot. And then in February, another feature team takes on the role of surprise team, and then you have this rotating responsibility over the year.
All right, thank you very much. And once again, Larman.
Thank you.